Greetings sailors and welcome back to World of Warships and a view replay courtesy of SOCOM Spetsnaz here. A name you probably aren't going to recognise at all, but if I say instead Mad Friday TV, suddenly it might sound a bit more familiar. So he is in the Richelieu, the tier 8 French battleship. It's a top tier game which is always nice when you're in tier 8. It depends on the time of day you're playing exactly, but there's usually a fairly hefty risk of getting down tiered to tier 10 instead, which can be a bit of a nasty experience. But for top tier, well, this is fairly decent matchmaking. There's no carriers to worry about. There's a couple of destroyers, but not huge numbers, 2 per side, which is not too bad considering this is a standard game. If this was a domination game, only having 2 destroyers might actually make things quite awkward. But for a standard game, 2 destroyers is okay. So it's a fairly even mix otherwise between battleships and cruisers. The ship itself, though, beyond looking at the wiki page, you know, I haven't played this, so my experience is strictly limited to the Lyon and below at the moment. So I can say it's got 15-inch guns, I can say it's got good short to mid-range AA, I can say it's got the speed boost and a decent base speed on top of that. I can say, of course, it's got this double all-forward turret configuration, and it basically is the big brother of the Dunkirk. This was basically an upscaled Dunkirk design, because the Dunkirk, the two, was it 2 ships of that class? I can't remember, but they were built specifically to counter the German commerce raiders with 11-inch guns. And for battleships, therefore, they didn't have particularly thick armour, and didn't have particularly big guns either themselves, but this is, you know, just upscaled in every direction, and so better armour, bigger guns. But aside from that, aside from looking at the stats and seeing that it's got a decent turret traverse and stuff like that, there's nothing like actually playing a ship to get a handle on it. So although this is going to be a very good result, I don't know if this is going to be, let's say, an exceptional result for this ship, although I have a feeling it might be, because the French battleships so far, up to tier 7 anyway, they're not fantastic in terms of dispersion. That, by the way, that was absolutely the wrong thing to do in a Miyoko. I mean, getting the double citadels was quite nice from Mad Friday's point of view, but yeah, that from the Miyoko's point of view, that was a bad move, and it got punished hard. That's not always the case with battleships, as we're going to see with the enemy Kutuzov, who is also going to be broadside a lot, but gets away with it for far, far longer. So as this is that all-forward turret design, I think this is not going to be an uncommon experience when playing this ship. I mean, I've got the Nelson and I've got the Izumo, and I've played both a fair bit, so doing this at least seems relatively familiar to me. But there are going to be times when that turret arrangement trips you up. You know, for this kind of situation, it's fine, although you can only sustain it for so long. Depending on quite how many ships are firing at you. And, you know, if there's a carrier in play and you're sat there reversing and you don't have very good AA, then it also makes you very vulnerable to that. But for now, this is relatively comfortable. You might have noted, though, he does only have the standard consumables. He's not using the premium version, so he's got 1 less than he might have otherwise, and that might be a problem. Now, there's one thing I want to note with this replay, by the way, this video. This is going to be the last one with my current PC, as it is right now. The last parts have arrived. In fact, it was just the case I needed, and it ended up being a bit drawn out. Somebody else was going to get me the case as a birthday present, and then various things happened and that didn't happen, and so I ended up choosing it myself, and they basically just sent me some money for it. So that last bit ended up being very drawn out, but I'm now in a position where I can start putting it together. So that's my plan for this weekend, and there might be a hiatus of a few days, because whilst actually putting the hardware together is relatively quick to do, especially these days, it's then installing all the software and doing all the updates and all the rest of it, and making sure I've got everything I need and transferring over my data that is going to take a while. I'm using some of my current drives though, and I'm reusing my current graphics card. So those were some things I did to save money, but I also got myself a new somewhat high capacity hard drive to go in there as well. I'm going to have a hard drive that is just for old copies of Warships and Tanks clients, because those are starting to seriously take up some space, even though I have deleted by this point some of the much older ones. At one point I had Warships clients all the way back to the beginning of open beta, and I don't anymore. I've deleted the oldest ones, but purely because they were taking up so much space. But you know, the chances of me needing to go and play a replay from that far back are somewhat minimal, because that's what, 2+ years ago at this point. So it's not like I've been keeping all of them, and I have been saving space by basically compressing them into 7-zip files, which actually, you know, can shave up like 40-50% off the actual the client size. But it's quite a time-consuming process if I need to unzip them once that's done. Hell, even just doing that in the first place is quite time-consuming. So yeah, there's going to be a hard drive just for that. I've got a hard drive just for video stuff. I'm going to have like a main drive where all the games and random crap goes. And then I think I decided... Did I buy another SSD? No, I think I decided to keep using my current SSD, which is still in fairly good nick. And that's going to be my operating system drive. So everything's going to be fairly nicely proportioned out, and I'm no longer going to be running into space issues, which will be quite nice. So yeah, this will be the last one on the old rig, which has served me quite well the last 4 years, but it is getting a bit long in the tooth, and particularly what I am hoping to be able to do is start doing videos much more regularly in 60 FPS. I mean, there's some videos where it will be totally unnecessary to do 60 FPS. The Wesnoth video that I just did, for instance, wouldn't really have gained anything by being in 60 FPS. But Warships, I can't consistently record Warships footage in 60 FPS. And while I can for tanks, the extra processing time involved is quite substantial. So I did for a while. I was putting out some 60 FPS videos up till towards the end of last year, but not on a consistent basis, and I just kind of gave up on the idea totally, at least for the time being. So that's a very useful kill there with that Z23. They could have been a substantial problem, but as it is, they're taking out the equation, and now we've got a bit of movement going. But this can be a bit of a, like, this can be a trap almost on some standard games, the standard games on some maps rather, in that you think you've got some momentum going and everybody rushes forward, and suddenly, well, the enemy team's firepower has become concentrated in one place and it starts to go a bit wrong. In this case, although they are getting some traction, although they've forced the enemy team back, they've only actually killed 4 ships. The enemy team still has a fair bit of firepower left. So there is that danger that they push in too far, and the destroyers especially, if they're seriously trying to cap, I don't know why. It's not a good plan, because what's happening is a bunch of enemy ships are coming back, and so Mad Friday's team is very likely going to lose both those destroyers unless they get out of there pretty quick. And the Mayhan looks like they might be able to do it, but the Mayhan is also the lower health ship. The Madder's not even really positioned so they could get back down the channel quickly. So in some ways they're trying to, you know, come forward to come to the rescue of these guys, but it also means they're pushing forward into potentially an awkward crossfire, because you see that North Carolina over there? They've been reversing now for a little while, and because they are reversing, I mean, it means they're not being particularly effective for their team, but it also means they're in a really awkward position as far as Mad Friday and his allies here are concerned. Because this guy's bow on, so relatively hard to knock any big chunks of health out of, and they can either angle against the stuff to the west that's pushed in to defend against these marauding destroyers, the second of which is now about to die, so well done those destroyers, or they can you know, ignore the fact that there's North Carolina there pelting them with shells from, at this point, of the back line. And even though they're not going to be that effective from that distance, there's still the chance that they could do some nasty chunks of damage. So this has suddenly become a sort of awkward position. And I'm not going to say what the North Carolina's done is wrong, necessarily, but it's certainly put them in a position where they can't be particularly effective. It's more of a tactical nuisance rather than an immediate threat to Mad Friday or his allies. What is a threat is this big group of firepower, this big group of enemy ships that are now in the enemy cap, who all came back to the enemy cap, partly because they've been forced there, and partly because the destroyers were there trying to cap them out. So those destroyers really, like, I don't know what they were thinking. I really don't. There was no way they were going to actually seriously have a chance of capping that out. So the entire exercise was just a pointless one, you know, it's how to throw your ship away. So Mad Friday's swung out wide a bit. It doesn't want to ignore this North Carolina, but it's put him in a really awkward position, and he's taking a bit of damage in the process, but nothing horribly substantial. He's run through all his heals at this stage, though. I'm not quite sure why he's not using the premium consumables. It might just be he needs to save the credits. But this has all pulled him away from the Scharnhorst, the Fiji, and was there another ship he was with? I'm not sure. The Scharnhorst just ploughed face first into the enemy ships. Did take one down with them, so it was an equal trade at least. In fact, I think they might even have got 2 kills, that Scharnhorst. But it means that Mad Friday wasn't really in a great position to assist. The Fiji's gotten away, though, with the aid of smoke, and there is now North Carolina coming up on this side as well. The other flank, it seems to have been a similar story. Some ships pressed forward and got severely punished. There are a couple of ships that hung back and are still alive, and you can just about see that the Richelieu on the other flank, well, they're sort of, what, 50-60% health at the moment, so they've taken some damage, but they are quite far back at this point. So this has suddenly started to reverse on them. Their team is still ahead on points. If Mad Friday can get this low health Cleveland, it'll put them either further ahead on points, but suddenly this seeming advantage that they had has been nullified by the enemy team because they rushed in from both flanks and ran into this concentrated firepower. They didn't have enough advantage in terms of numbers of ships for it to be a surefire thing. Mad Friday himself has been doing alright though, 100,000 damage already, and I'll tell you now, he's definitely not done yet. And there we go, he does get that Cleveland and the Kraken, and that puts him even further ahead on points, so that's a useful kill. Although it probably felt like he was being persecuted to that Cleveland player. It's never very fun in this situation where you're in a low health bottom tier cruiser and killing you actually is the most sensible thing that the other team could do. And you're just frantically trying to stay alive. You definitely don't feel like life is very fair at that point. So, they just need to not lose ships, really. Although, having said that, they have just lost a Gneiser now, so that's not so good. None of the enemy ships are really quite as low health as that Cleveland, but there are some fairly beat-up specimens left, this Leon particularly. And because these are 15-inch guns, and that's a Tier 7 battleship, there's every chance he can overmatch the bow if he can get the hit. But because he's further away at this point, he's not really in a position where he's tanking anything. If anything, it's the Fiji that seems to be... I mean, they've come back out and re-smoked, but the enemy team is trying to hit the Fiji, and now they're trying to hit this North Carolina a bit as well. So Mad Friday's had this window where he's been a bit further back and firing away, but not really using his armor, not really using his hit points. Although, I suppose once you're in that situation of not having a heal, it's not necessarily a bad thing to be much more cautious at that stage. But he's still reasonably healthy. He's still got 40k. So he can't be... he can't afford to be out of this fight entirely. He can't afford to be that battleship driver that sits at the back and doesn't really engage and looks around after a while and wonders why all their allies are dead. So the North Carolina, we can see, is coming back in, is re-engaging at this point. You know, that was an example of a player doing that, and although they did make it awkward-ish for Mad Friday's team, as I say, I don't think that North Carolina has ended up being terribly effective, but they do have a lot of hit points and they do still need to be dealt with, so it is a little bit of an issue. But they are now coming back in at a point where most of their allies are dead, and they are going to be outnumbered in terms of guns. So even though they have quite a lot of hit points, it's less of an issue than it might be. So Mad Friday now reversing and actually using one of his remaining speed boosts, because otherwise he would have run himself aground. The angling, I'm not sure about the armor profile on this thing from the rear, because sometimes showing your rear like this is not necessarily a good thing. But from having played against Richelieus, it seems like they're reasonably tough, as long as you're not doing something stupid like sitting broadside, as we saw in my last supporter video, where Andy CX got to just do very bad things to a completely broadside Richelieu at very close range. But that's not the situation that's going on here. He is trying to keep the angling. And the only thing that might considerably cause him problems is the Bismarck on the other side. But they're currently engaged with the New Orleans, who's about to go down. That Richelieu is still quite far back. The Richelieu on the other flank, I think that was a case of a battleship player letting a cruiser go in and tank the damage for them, even though they seem to have taken a bit of damage themselves. But they've not, you know, they didn't follow through. They weren't helping that New Orleans. And so the New Orleans is now dead, and the Richelieu on that other flank is now alone. And this is... they're still ahead on points, but this is perilously even in terms of the actual situation right now. The greatest concentration of force is over here. And, well, now that that Bismarck has been able to deal with the stuff that was immediately threatening him, he's now able to turn his attention over here. And so it's not just the North Carolina they've got to deal with, it's the Bismarck. And I'm pretty sure that Fiji is out of smokes at this point as well, because we're coming down to the last 2 minutes of battle. There wasn't a lot I could cut out of this one. It was basically like the first minute and a half, 2 minutes of everyone getting into position, as I normally take out of replays. And then after that, it was just action all the way. So up to 130k, there's a Confederate medal to go along with his Kraken and his devastating strike. He clearly wants to turn around to engage at this point, and the Bismarck doesn't seem to be actively pointing his guns this way. So he's got a bit of an opportunity to do it, but he has to be careful in that the North Carolina might put his next salvo this way. Now the Fiji going down was a little bit inevitable. Being this close to battleships in a Fiji is never healthy, unless you get extremely lucky and are able to get in to torpedo them. The North Carolina that's here as well, you know, I'm not quite sure what to make of their performance. They've clearly been doing less in terms of damage and whatever else than Mad Fridays, but I don't know if I can say, oh yeah, this play is being terrible or ineffective or anything. So it's a bit of a risky turn they made there, but I mean, they're largely getting away with it. And at this point, well, we're coming to the fun part of this replay, I guess we could say. They're firmly ahead on points. It's the last minute. They are going to win on just points alone, even if they don't kill this last hipper. And I think, realising this, Mad Friday decides he's going to get this last bit of damage, because this North Carolina is still quite healthy. So here we go. Ramming speed! All power to the engines, and boop! And because, of course, it's two battleships trading, the point situation remains completely unchanged. He's gifted the North Carolina player a bunch of hit points, obviously, but he got a lot back in return himself. So 178,000 damage and an extra kill. 8 kills in a warships game. I mean, some of them were kill secures, if we can put it that way. Some of them were very low health and targets that he hadn't necessarily done a lot of damage to himself. Just, you know, picked up that last kill. But still, 8 kills in a warships game. Getting fully 2/3 of the enemy team. That's not bad. So we can look at the score screen and see that obviously he was top of his team, no surprise there. The North Carolina that was with him maybe wasn't that effective, they were below the fold. But the Richelieu on the other flank must have been doing something, even if they seemed a bit excessively cautious just from watching the mini-map, because they managed to place, what was that? I've forgotten already, it was up mere seconds ago, and I have the brain of a goldfish apparently. 3rd place on the team, there we go. So yeah, overall that was a fairly good game, I thought. As I say, I'm not that familiar with Richelieu myself, But it was that ending that made it for me, that made me decide that, yeah, I'm going to show this one. This is quite an entertaining one, especially that last bit. Because how often do we get to see a bit of good old-fashioned battleships ramming into each other action? It's always fun when it happens, although not necessarily fun if it happens to you when you're explicitly trying to avoid it, but nonetheless. Anyway, so hopefully you have enjoyed this replay, and if you have, you can hit the like button, and you can leave any comments below. You can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.